Let's go. We got no time to waste. Let's get another speedrun game in. 1729 with black. Luke C24. Okay, good luck, Luke. Hopefully we get a juicy game, and hopefully we get a mainline accelerated dragon. We will. I'm maybe needlessly excited, but this is only our second mainline accelerated, and this is amazing because we actually get a Maróczy bind. And the Maróczy bind is the reason why the majority of people who refuse to play the accelerated dragon, what they most fear, and for very good reason, is the Maróczy bind. The Maróczy bind it's both a variation and a structure, and the structure that it refers to is specifically Sicilian structures with a white pawn on e4 and a white pawn on c4. Why is it called a bind? Well, because these pawns are both aiming at the d5 square, and if you watched my previous video, you will know that one of the main ideas of the accelerated dragon is to push d5 and liberate black's pieces, open up the center. Now this move becomes virtually impossible. Why is it called Maróczy? Geza Maróczy was a Hungarian player, lived, I think, in the second half of the 19th century, one of the probably top 10, top 15 in the world at his peak. And, he sort of developed and described this concept. We stand on the shoulders of giants. Now, the variation that I want to show you against the Maróczy bind is a very dangerous sideline that slips through the cracks very often. You might assume that bishop g7 here is automatic, right? I mean, why would you not fianchetto your bishop? And yet there is a sideline which I think is more dangerous and more practical for newer players and intermediate players, and this immediately challenges white in the sense that it gives black chances to fight for an advantage. So what you do is you actually start with knight f6, you delay the fianchettoing of the bishop, and this move should make sense to everybody. You're immediately attacking the e4 pawn. And an important side note is that if white takes on c6 and then plays e5 and tries to push this knight out of f6, this is a very common trap. Black has a check on a5. I'll show that on the board after the game, picking up the e5 pawn. So this works out tactically. Now here's step two, and step two might seem odd to people who've never seen this line before. Now you take on d4, and you send white's queen into the center, and again, this should look very dangerous to you because you're allowing your knight to get pinned, and e5 might seem like a very dangerous threat, but concretely, this works out for black. And because of e5, it's important to refrain from bishop g7 here because that walks into e5. So here, you throw in the move d6, and you do that in order to, well, obviously, you're opening up the bishop, but you're also halting the progress of white's e-pawn. White can still play e5, but then you just take it. And if white trades queens, then, yeah, our king has lost castling rights, but it's not worth the price of a pawn for white to get that position. This is one of the main lines, but it's definitely considered a sideline in comparison to bishop g7 here, which is the most popular move. Anything that's not the sort of direct path I call a sideline. Sideline doesn't mean it's not commonly played. It just means it's less popular than the main line. Now, what is the high-level idea of taking on d4? It's actually very simple. After we fianchetto the bishop, the white queen is in our crosshairs. So we're trying to gain essentially a tempo for development by forcing white's queen onto an awkward spot. So eventually, after we go bishop g7, white's queen is going to have to back out of d4. There might not be an immediate threat of a discovered attack. In fact, there isn't. But after we complete our development, there will be, and we're going to gain a very important tempo for our development. And it's not always easy for white to find a good spot for the queen. Moving it all the way back to d1, that's kind of lame. And the queen just doesn't have all that many good squares in these types of structures. So we now fianchetto our bishop to g7. Bishop e2 is one of the main moves. And on the next move, we are going to castle. Okay, our opponent castles. We castle as well. And you should note that at this present moment, there is still no threat of a discovered attack against white's queen because knight takes e4 doesn't work. The queen takes the knight and gets out of the discovery. Same with knight to d5, right? The queen controls both of those squares. But bishop e3 is a positional mistake because it allows a third discovery. And this third discovery isn't dangerous because it wins anything. It's dangerous and it's bad for white because we engineer a favorable trade. What am I talking about? If you're watching on YouTube, pause the video, see if you can figure it out. Well, there aren't that many viable squares for the knight. Yeah, as everybody is pointing out, bishop e3 is a mistake, and I believe that bishop g5 is the best move in the position instead, or queen to d1, because we're able to play knight to g4 and trade our knight for white's dark squared bishop. And why is that good? Well, that's good primarily because our bishop is then totally uncontested, and we've got a monopoly on all of the dark squares in the center. And, you know, monopoly on squares in chess is very, very good. I would say that black is already better. Not much better. We're not, you know, winning or anything like that, but we've definitely solved all of our opening problems after this trade, and we're able now to fight for the advantage. Our bishop becomes an absolute monster. I mean, if you've seen any Sicilian dragon games, you should know that when white gives up their dark squared bishop for a knight, obviously it's different when white trades his dark squared bishop for our dark squared bishop. That's often favorable for white. But an uncontested dark squared bishop in any Sicilian dragon structures, whether it's an accelerated dragon or a regular dragon, is often incredibly dangerous for white, both positionally and tactically. Okay, so now we need to solve the sort of final opening problem with which we are faced, which is the question of where to position our light squared bishop. And there's a couple of options. I don't think there's a very clear correct answer here. Perhaps most of you are thinking either about bishop to d7 or maybe about fianchettoing that bishop. The reason I don't like fianchettoing the bishop is that white can position the f-pawn to f3, and our bishop on b7 is just going to be biting on granite. So we want our bishop to actually be doing something to be, you know, tangibly contributing to the pressure. And there's really only one square from which the bishop is able to do that, and it's e6, right? It's a weird move. You don't play that move often, but just because the developing move is uncommon doesn't mean you should automatically throw it out. And in the accelerated dragon, bishop to e6 is actually a very common developing move. The other option is to go bishop to d7 and essentially prepare a queenside pawn break with a6 and b5. Expanding the queenside is a very good plan in these positions because ultimately we do want to break into the Maróczy bind. We want to open up the center so that our bishops have more prospects, but that's going to come a little bit later, and it's hard to get b5 in because white can meet a6 with a4. So we shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket. Why not e5 before bishop e6? Well, e5 is a very, very bad move here positionally because it closes down the dark squared bishop completely, right? It's going to be staring into our own pawn. We want to avoid that. And second of all, we create a massive hole on d5 that white can use as a ready-made outpost for his knight. So we definitely want to avoid pushing our e-pawn to e5 in most circumstances in these Maróczy bind positions. There are some exceptions, mostly when we have a knight on c6 that we can establish on d4. That mixes things up a little bit, but let's just get our bishop out in this position. And we get 10 subs from Durjati. Thank you, Durjati, for the 10 subs. Damn girl. What I like about the accelerated dragon is that it's actually quite easy to play, even if you don't know, all of the theory or all of the ideas. What are our ideas here? Well, first of all, we're putting pressure on c4. Rook c8 is a move that comes to mind. We need to be careful about the a7 pawn, of course. So that's why we could play a6. But you often see accelerated dragon players actually go a5 and grab as much space as possible on the queen side. And a5 is a positionally risky move because it does, because it does weaken the b5 square. But the b5 square is not necessarily relevant to the position as a whole. What you have to understand is an outpost isn't inherently good. Just because a piece sits on a square where it can't be chased away by a pawn, that's the definition of an outpost, it doesn't make that piece necessarily good. And the b5 square isn't such a big, find for white. Just because white plays knight b5, that doesn't disturb us in any way. So that this is a good application of that concept, which is why we can play a5 really without much worry about its drawbacks. So a5 comes to mind. The idea is to drive the pawn down to a4 and grab as much space as possible, and then we could drop our queen onto a5 and just put more pressure on white's queen side. So that's one concept. We can play a5. We can play queen to a5 immediately, and again, pressure the knight, pressure the a2 pawn. Just that queen on a5 is also very safe. It's hard to attack. So that move comes to mind. And we could follow up by playing rook f to c8. And the positive of that approach is by playing rook c8 immediately, we do drop the a7 pawn, and we don't just want to give away pawns in this position. So there's a lot of possibilities here. We can go a6, we can go a5, we can go queen to a5. Now, when possible, I prefer piece play over pawn play just because I think it's easier to understand and it's more instructive. So we're actually going to go queen to a5. And it's a non-committal move. Queen a5 is a very non-committal move. We improve our position tangibly, we connect our rooks, and we leave our pawns on their initial places because we don't know exactly later on whether we'll want to go a6 or a5. This move should be totally understandable to everybody. Just putting the queen in a good square, easy access to the center. Later on, we can go queen to c5 maybe and offer a queen trade, try to secure the d4 square for our dark squared bishop. Queen to e5 is also a later possibility. Yeah, so in these types of openings, you should also understand that allowing your opponent to expand can be a good thing for you. If white plays a3 and b4, not only is the a3 pawn likely to hang, but the c4 pawn is also going to be a lot harder to defend, right? The only way to defend that pawn with a pawn is to play b3. So if you can induce b4, that's often a good thing for you. But players often, as I have said many speed runs ago, the move that players fear the most after a check, especially newer players, are moves that attack your queen. It's just a phobia of facing a move that attacks your queen. Remember that that is just as harmless in most cases as any other threat. You can move your queen. So making a move to induce a weakness is a very advanced type of move that players are often unwilling to make, but you should work on, your knee-jerk reaction to moves that attack your queen. Now, I'm not talking about forks and moves that trap the queen. Obviously, they can be dangerous, but they aren't intrinsically dangerous. So note that we are not threatening to take on c3 here because white can recapture with the queen, and then if we take on a2, our queen does get trapped with rook to a1. Plus, I really would not want to give away the pride of our position for a corner pawn, even if we could get away with that. In most cases, I'd like to keep our bishop alive until a better opportunity comes along. So our next move is very likely to be rook f to c8. If white plays knight to d5, that's also why we positioned the bishop on e6 to restrict the knight. And knight d5, we will definitely take that knight, and all of white's queenside pawns are going to be hanging as a result. So that's not really an option for white. Yeah, rook ac8 is possible, but the reason I like rook f to c8 is also because later when we go a6 and b5, our rook on a8 could actually be a valuable piece. The a file could open up later, and keeping our pieces on the queen side is a good idea. We could also go a6 and put the rook on b8 to help prepare b5. So when we go rook f c8, the other rook does have a role to play on the queen side. Whereas if we do it the other way, if we go rook a c8, not only do we have to, keep the a pawn protected by the queen, and that's a bit of a headache, but it would be harder to prepare a6 and b5. Rook a1. Okay, so our opponent is starting to panic. The reason I think he panicked is because I think our opponent thought that bishop takes c3 was a threat. So actually here taking on c3 makes a lot of sense because we would be permanently crippling white's queenside pawn structure, and those resulting pawns would be total sitting ducks. So bishop takes c3 and then rook f to c8 would be a great approach. I think that would probably be one of the best moves. But we could also play rook f to c8 straight away. The bad thing about rook a1 is that it invalidates b3. That move is now no longer possible because the knight hangs, right? We're attacking it twice, and it's only being defended once. So after rook f to c8, white actually can't really even defend the c4 pawn. Because if white plays knight d5, as we've already discussed, we snap that knight off the board, and then our dark squared bishop could travel to b2 land and take that pawn away. So there's two possibilities here. We can start by removing the knight from the board and then playing rook f c8. And then we will win the c4 pawn and likely win another pawn on c3. Or we could play the immediate rook f c8. I think both options are fantastic. There is a concrete line I'm trying to calculate here. Yeah, and I think it does work out for us. So let's go rook f c8. So again, There is a reason that I didn't choose rook AC8. It's a concrete line, and I'll show you after the game what I calculated. There's a specific situation, maybe we'll get it in the game, in which the rook on A8, believe it or not, I think an extra defender on the A7 pawn becomes important in a particular line. And the line is after knight D5, which I think is not unlikely. Bishop takes D5, E takes D5, bishop takes B2. So we attack the rook on A1. The rook moves to B1. Our bishop drops back to F6. We're going to get this in the game, right? We're going to get this in the game. Okay, our opponent plays CD, which I think is a mistake because it opens up the C file for us. So this might render what I'm telling you null and void because we might get another option. Okay, so here we should pause for a second and establish that we don't necessarily have to take on B2 right away, right? There's ways to try to squeeze more juice out of this position. So one thing that comes to mind is rook to C2. Not only are we going after the B2 pawn, but we're also activating our rook and trying to maximize the value of the open file. So we should calculate, right? Bishop takes B2, white plays rook A B1. And in that position, notice that queen takes A2 would be a blunder. Who sees why? Who sees why we can't take both pawns in one fell swoop? What does white have in that position? White has a very nasty little move, right? So queen E3 back to D2. And the bishop on B2 is pinned, and we lose the bishop. All right, so we can't take both pawns. What we can do is play bishop takes B2, rook A B1, and then drop our bishop back, let's say, to F6. And there you can see why I wanted to keep a rook on A8. Because if white takes on B7 in that resulting position, we can safely take the pawn on A2, and A7 isn't hanging, right? And we can actually just send that pawn up the board. I think we're going to do that in this for the sake of simplicity, right? This is a very simple way to play. Maybe not the best computer option, but it gives black a huge advantage. So hopefully you can follow that line in your head. Rook A B1, bishop F6. Rook A B1, bishop F6. Why bishop F6 and not bishop, somewhere else? For another straightforward reason. After rook takes B7, E7 is also going to be hanging otherwise. So bishop F6 is the only way to circumvent that issue, right? Not that losing E7 would have even been such a big deal. I mean, maybe even sacrificing it would have been interesting. But if the E7 pawn is taken away, then our king starts feeling a little bit uncomfortable, right? If a rook lands on E7, white could play queen F4 and start harassing the F7 pawn. It's a headache we don't have to deal with here. White is borderline lost in this position. Another important positional point is that opposite colored bishops is something that people often associate with draws, right? You're often taught that opposite colored bishop endgames are drawn a lot of the time, and that's true, right? And I won't delve into the reasons for that. It is true that in opposite colored bishop endgames, right, when you literally have one bishop for one side and one bishop for the other side, and they're of different colors, the drawing potential is huge. And mostly that is concerned with the fact that you can easily set up a blockade on a particular complex of squares, right? Because you have a monopoly on the light squares, for example. And so you can envision a lot of situations where the pawns reach a certain square and then they just can't move forward, and you can't allow them to move forward because you don't have the machinery to do that. But in middle games, that could not be further from the truth, right? In opposite colored bishop middle games, you don't have any of that drawing potential because you've got the heavy pieces to support, let's say, pawns. And you also have a lot of attacking potential because if you have complete control over all of the dark squares, you can actually attack on the dark squares. Your opponent doesn't have the defensive machinery to defend against that. So I'm really belaboring the point, but the point is that you shouldn't be afraid of opposite colored bishop middle games because you can definitely win them. All right, so queen b3. This doesn't create a threat. I mean, queen takes b7 is not a threat because a2 hangs. But what we should avoid here is the move rook to c3. Maybe some of you are thinking, because after queen takes b7, the rook on a8 actually hangs. So the kind of Soviet schoolboy move would be b6. Just eliminate the headache of that pawn. But there's some other moves that I like here, and I like a more aggressive approach. All right, so in general, whenever a piece moves from a square, you should always, in the back of your head, kind of keep in mind which squares are now available to your pieces, right? Which squares have been relinquished by your opponent. And this is especially true when you've got very active pieces that can infiltrate your opponent's territory. So one move that I love here is actually queen to d2. And you might say, well, is this risky? We're just sending our queen into unknown territory. But here you can really see how much we control the game. We're controlling the b2 square. We're controlling the c-file. Even if the queen is chased away, first of all, the bishop is hanging. White has to address that. Even if the queen is chased away, this is what I was saying earlier, the queen has a gazillion different ways to retreat. It can retreat to the king side, to f4. It can retreat to the c-file. It can even retreat back to a5. So our queen is perfectly safe here. It's got a million escape routes, and we shouldn't be afraid of infiltrating. And what is the purpose of putting the queen on d2? Well, it's just a great square. We're still hitting the a2 pawn. We're just forcing white to make concessions, right? We're forcing white to move the bishop. And if the bishop moves, let's say, to g4, then we can lift our rook simply up to c7 in order to protect the b7 pawn. And then later we can try to stack the rooks on the c-file. We could expand a little bit on the king side as well with a move like h5. So wherever the bishop is going to go, it's going to be vulnerable to further attacks. There's bishop g4. Now, again, I don't like rook c2 because of queen takes b7, and the rook in the corner hangs. And then you could say, listen, we could go rook c2, queen takes b7, we could move the rook, and we could try to go after the f2 pawn. We could try to go for mate here. But it's unnecessary. Rook c7 is a perfectly safe, low-risk option. And that bishop on g4, this is what I was saying, is actually very vulnerable. It's vulnerable to h5. It's vulnerable to a move like queen f4, which hits the bishop and hits the pawn on e4. So to win these positions, you have to be very patient. And you just got to accumulate the small advantages, right? You do one thing, and then you do another thing. And eventually you're going to get your opportunity to infiltrate and launch the decisive invasion or idea or whatever it is. Right? So you just need to kind of... And this is also important because you don't have to have a plan really in these types of positions. I don't have a plan here. I'm just sort of improving moves individually, move by move, with an eye toward, being aware of options, decisive options when they occur, looking for tactics, looking for hanging pawns. But largely, I'm just sort of accumulating my advantages here. It's a simple position to play here, actually. It's a very easy position to play reasonably well. Yeah, so I'm expecting rook f to d1 or rook b to d1, and queen f4 looks like is calling my name there. Queen f4, and then maybe once the bishop moves from this diagonal, probably back to f3 to protect the e4 pawn, then we can stack the rooks on c8, and that's good because then we have, on demand, we can infiltrate the second rank. And that might already be the beginning of the end. If white plays f3, that's actually what we want, because f3 does a couple of things. It weakens the a7 g1 diagonal, and bishop d4 could come with a check later in the game. But it also weakens the second rank, so once we go rook c2, we will have direct access to the g2 pawn, and that already is a precursor to a mating attack. So let's go queen f4. Let's go queen f4, aiming at a bunch of important pawns and trying to knock the bishop off of the diagonal. Yeah, so white can also play queen f3 here. And then we'll have a choice. We do not have to trade queens. We absolutely don't have to trade queens. We could drop our queen a little bit further back to g5. But I think we will trade queens because if white plays g takes f3 there, well, those are more weaknesses on the king side that we could explain. And I also really want to kind of showcase how to convert an endgame advantage of this sort. So I like the option of taking on f3. I love the option of going queen g5. That might allow us to win the game faster. And I do have to go very soon, so it's kind of in my best interest to win fast. Yeah, let's keep the queens on the board. And, as long as you understand that queen takes f3 there is a perfectly viable alternative. It's a matter of taste. But I want to finish him off here sooner rather than later. Yeah, we're grinding this one down. No, I don't think it would be terribly difficult to convert the endgame. That will be, by the way, in a chapter in an endgame video, obviously called Bishop Endgames. That's going to be analyzed in detail. Now we've got all of the same threats that we would have if the queens were off the board. So if we had traded on f3, we actually probably would have just gone rook to c2 and gone after the a pawn. And once we remove the a pawn, we just run our passer up the board. It would be totally unstoppable. In a classical game against a GM, I would trade queens here and go rook c2. No question about it. But we still have the same concept in this position. We want to go rook c2. As some of you are pointing out, rook to c3 is also a very nasty threat. But we just want to go rook c2, win the a2 pawn, and promote our a pawn. It's as simple as that. We don't give a damn about white taking on b7 anymore because the e7 pawn is well protected. The 7th rank gives white nothing here. So, yeah, the win is very straightforward here. Queen e2, back. Our opponent goes back, which is a good move. Our opponent stops rook c2. So kudos for some resilient defense. So I think that we should throw in the move h5 without even a second thought. It's a helpful move because it grabs some space on the king side. You also might know that this pawn structure, f7, g6, h5, is often considered to be a model or ideal pawn structure in a lot of endgames because the pawns protect each other and they're not on the same rank. I know this is like way in the future, but the reason this is recommended is often because the pawns are hard to win. Like your opponent can only take one of them at one time with a rook, whereas if they're in the same rank, you could just snap them off the board by going to one particular rank. So this is more important usually in rook endgames, but it's just one of those small things to keep in mind. f7, g6, h5, you'll often see GMs kind of arranging their pawns that way because you're looking toward the future, toward the endgame. Bishop h3, good move. Preventing rook a c8. Our opponent defending very well here, I have to say. Okay, so that means we should slow it down a little bit. And we should continue making gradual and small improving moves. I definitely should have traded queens. That would have been more efficient. So I will acknowledge that was probably an inaccuracy on my part, for sure. To be completely honest, I missed bishop h3. Like, I didn't realize our opponent could continue preventing us from doubling on the c file, which would end the game immediately, because once we hit the c2 square, it just ends the game. So we should be very patient here. Yeah, rook c3 is a very good-looking move to threaten rook takes bishop, right, because the g-pawn is pinned. But I don't like one-move threats like that. I think we should continue improving. And the move I really want to make here is b6, right? I want to eliminate the headache of the b7 pawn, so that our rook is free to roam about the cabin. Rook c3 is not as good as some people think it is, because I think white has this move g3, and g3 intercepts the contact the rook is making with the bishop, and it prepares the move f4. And if we allow g3 and f4, our queen is going to be banished to h6, and yeah, white will weaken his king, but it will not be the ideal scenario. So if white plays g3 here, first of all, I'll be impressed, because that is a high-level move to kind of push a pawn in front of your own king like that is not easy to do. But we will need to find some way to respond to the positional threat of f4. g3 played. Okay, so what are we going to do here? Well, let me think for a second. I have a very interesting idea. It's kind of creative. So here's what we're going to do. I think at a high level, this is something I've talked about previously. When we talk about prophylaxis, and prophylaxis is the fancy chess term for stopping your opponent's threats, there is essentially two types of prophylaxis. I call it type 1 and type 2 prophylaxis. Type 1 prophylaxis is physically preventing the possibility of a move, right? So what would be an example of type 1 prophylaxis here? It would be the move bishop to e5. It physically stops f4. White can still play it, but it's a bad move because we take on f4 with the bishop. The g-pawn is pinned. The problem with bishop e5 is that it's a band-aid, and white could slide their king over to h1. And not only will f4, the threat, be renewed, but it will be an even more powerful threat because then it will win a piece. But there is also type 2 prophylaxis, which is you allow the move to happen, but in some sense you take the sting out of it, or you make a move such that the effectiveness of a particular move has been diminished in some way. So what's an example of that? And this is the move we're going to play. what do I notice about the move f4? Well, first of all, it weakens white's king. Second of all, it does weaken this g3 pawn. So what move can we make to preemptively put a little bit of pressure on the g3 pawn and try to discourage white from playing f4? Or at least, further the consequences of that move, we play h4. And if you look at this move, you might say, well, I don't understand. Like, we're not winning the g3 pawn. Right now, it's very well protected. But if white plays f4, we drop our queen back to h6. We x-ray the bishop on h3, and we then threaten to play h takes g3 and win the bishop. And maybe also you could consider the idea of sliding the king up and deploying the rook to h8. So opening up the h-file could result in a checkmating attack. And of course, white does not have to go f4, but then we're chilling. And we could follow up with a move like rook c3 here, Hit that g3 pawn where it hurts. So type 2 prophylaxis, very important tool in your tool bag. Okay, our opponent offers the queen trade, giving us a second chance to right the wrongs. At this point, I think trading makes a lot of sense. It still bums me out that we can't go rook ac8. And so we might have to give up control of the c-file, but that's really not a big deal. It's really not a big deal. Rook c4 is a possibility. We could tickle the e4 pawn first, but let's really just get down to business here and play rook c2. Let's get down to business and try to win this a2 pawn and end the game, because even if we give up the c-file, that really means nothing. Yeah, to defeat the Huns. You know what's funny is if white plays a4, the best move there, I think, is not rook a2. The bishop can defend the a4 pawn from d7. That's also a nasty idea because c6 is an outpost we should be aware of. Does anybody see what the best move is after a4? Spotting undefended pawns and pieces, right? You always have to be aware of where the undefended pawns are. Rook c2 back to c4. And what's funny is we should start with rook c3 here. Same concept. We're just driving the pawn forward, and then we're moving back to c4. I love these types of ideas. And if white defends with rook a1, well, we could still play rook c4 and open up a discovered attack on the rook, if I ever draw that arrow properly. No, the game is over. The game is over because once we win the a3 pawn or even the e4 pawn, white cannot survive this position 2 pawns down, because everything else is just going to start collapsing. Yeah, so this is over. So the Maróczy bind has been destroyed successfully. And this became a pretty one-sided game. Yeah, rook c4 after white allowed us to take that dark squared bishop. Those positions become very, very hard to handle. Those positions become very hard to handle. What do you do if rook a1? Well, rook a1, notice that square is protected by the bishop. Okay, now this move is a good thought by our opponent. The thing is, we don't give a single damn that these pawns are doubled. In fact, this is what we want. Even with one a pawn, I would prefer this position to be without the a7 pawn, because then our rook would actually support a5. But this is completely winning as it is. Much worse would have been rook takes e4, because the bishop drops back to f3 there, attacking the rook, and white would win the b6 pawn, allowing all of the pawns to be on the same flank. Those positions are much harder to win than when you have an outside passer on the other side of the board. Yeah, bishop d7 was the last chance, but it was still lost. And now, without a second thought, we just push. We could play h takes g3 first. It really doesn't matter. I don't care if white takes on h4. We won't even recapture with the bishop. In fact, we want to keep our bishop planted on this diagonal, and you'll see why in a second. Just without thought, just push forward. a3. The reason is that if white stops the pawn from in front with rook a2, we could stick that bishop on b2, and the rook is permanently arrested. So it'll take us a couple more moves to win this game, but it's all over. e4, okay, so well, we have a million ways to win here, but the elegant move here is bishop b2. This is the elegant way to win. You're intercepting the connection between the rook and the next square. We're not afraid of the exchange sacrifice, which our opponent might play. Yeah, but because this just wins an overwhelming amount of material, we could send our other pawn up the board. But if you want to play like a Russian schoolboy, why not take this pawn first? There's no hurry. The a pawn isn't going anywhere. Let's just take another pawn just in case. Take on e4 first. Be patient. Win with an abundance of caution. Now, rook e3 allows king f2, so let's just keep our rook on d4. Doesn't matter. We're happy to give up the e7 pawn as well. And you don't have to overdo this. So if our opponent goes rook b7, we certainly don't have to play king f8 there and protect every one of our pawns. At some point, you could just send the a pawn up the board. Okay, this is resignable. Okay, rook b4 is a nice move because it offers the rook trade and allows us to push the pawn more efficiently. Yeah, total full send. Our pawn's going to get to a3, and in the event that white stops it from a2, hopefully you know the drill. You just go rook b2, and you keep offering the rook trade to force the rook away from its blockading square. This is the kind of super common mechanism. So this was a smooth win, with maybe the one exception that I should have traded queens first when we had a chance. Now, unfortunately, I don't have much time, so I'm going to have to rush the analysis just a little bit, but we're going to get more chances to look at the theory of the Maróczy bind, so don't feel like this is our last Maróczy bind game. I'm going to kind of give a couple general thoughts on this line. So again, bishop g7 is the main move. This is the most popular line, and this goes knight f6, knight c3. Now there is this move knight g4, which is kind of a tactical line, but the tactics work out for black here, because if white takes the knight, then we take the other knight, and if white takes c6, then this is actually bad because we can take the bishop. So there's a lot of options here on the menu, and you don't have to play what I'm recommending, but I really think that knight f6 is the best line for beginner and intermediate players. So first important tactical detail is that if white takes and plays e5, we have queen a5 check, forking the king and the pawn. Then we pick up the pawn with check, and we're chilling. So knight c3 is virtually forced. Then we play knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and d6. And it is possible for white to play e5 here. This is a move that has been played by some strong players. But this endgame down a pawn is better for black. White has insufficient compensation according to the engine. I've looked at this. It's probably equal if white plays accurately, but this is nothing to be afraid of. In fact, I think the only move that keeps like chances for equality is just like bishop e2. And according to the engine, black deploys the bishop to e6, much like we did in the game. And if white castles, it's important not to be afraid of the rook coming to d1. Here I like the engine recommendation, knight to d7, covering the c5 square, so immobilizing the c4 pawn. And now if white plays rook to d1, the other idea of knight d7 is that we can expand a little bit on the king side with f5. Nice pawns here. And the point is that bishop f3 can be met now with e4, sending the bishop back. So you can analyze this further, but this is nothing to be afraid of, especially if you analyze this endgame a little bit. And obviously, if white takes back on e5, then bishop g7 is totally fine for black. So bishop e2 is one of the main moves. Castles, castles. And now the big mistake by white, of course, is to play bishop e3. Now, in terms of the theory, let me check what the most popular move is in this position. The most popular move in this position for white is to play, I think it's to move the queen. Let me see. Yeah, it's actually queen to d3. This is the most popular move, getting out of the x-ray. And here the main line continues bishop e6, but Magnus Carlsen has played the move a5 here. This is like the move that's been popular in the last couple of years among GMs. And I explained the idea of this move earlier. You're trying to push the pawn to a4 and make it harder for white to play the move b3. Because if white plays b3 immediately, can anybody spot why this move is wrong? If white plays this move with an undefended rook on a1, then black, not a4. a4 is good, but there's a better move, and it's knight takes e4. This is a tactic you have to remember if you're an accelerated dragon player. You have to be aware of this possibility. It exists also in the King's Indian, by the way. So if the queen takes, then we take on c3 and we win a pawn. And to add insult to injury, white can easily lose another exchange here. But very importantly, if knight takes c4, we take the rook, and if the bishop had been developed, then white would have been able to take on a1. That is horrible for black. Here, bishop h6 is nicely met with bishop g7. And is our king totally out of the woods? No, but we are up and exchanging a pawn, and white really can't cause many problems for our king, right? This check is not scary. Just don't be afraid to play f6 here and, you know, develop the little pawn cocoon. This is just winning for black. So for this reason, white needs to get the bishop out first. Let's say bishop e3. This is the most popular move. And now, of course, black plays a4, although Carlsen played bishop to d7 here. So I'll need to do a little bit of analysis here in preparation for the next accelerated video and really settle on a recommendation. But this line is pretty good. Now, the top engine move is bishop to d4. And now black continues the queenside expansion with queen a5. And if you flip on the engine in these types of positions, it does give a small advantage for white. But the point is, it's a very easy position to mishandle because white has, you know, white can essentially bite off more than they can chew. The main move here is f4, but Wei Yi played rook a to d1, which is a bit of a weird move. And here you can play bishop e6, or you can play bishop to d7 and deploy it to c6, which I think is the top computer recommendation. There was a game between a 2400 and a 2100 that went f4. And here the best response would have been to continue with the plan bishop c6, just a very rich position where black has a lot of active ideas. Bishop f3, for example. Now you can go rook f to d8. This looks like a mysterious rook move, right? Why put the rook on a closed file? But if white makes, you know, a random move, then we already play e5, explode the center, and give our pieces fantastic squares. This is an exception to the rule, by the way. I did say be careful about e5, but obviously here white loses the bishop, and so white has to move the bishop, and then we remove the pawn from e5, and we use that e5 square Frankfurt Airport type move as an outpost for our knight. I mean, look how active black's bishops are crisscrossing the board. a3 is a threat, another common idea in the accelerated to undermine the knight. And you're obviously not afraid of this because of knight e5, and white's pieces are totally discombobulated. So this can get very, very unpleasant for white very quickly. Of course, white can play the more modest f3, but you still continue with bishop c6. And this is the sort of one exception to the rule about trading dark squared bishops. There are situations in the accelerated dragon where trading dark squared bishops is actually good for black. And the reason is that the king is quite safe here. White doesn't have any attacking forces on the king side, and white just has to suffer with a very bad light squared bishop, which is staring at its own pawns. And black can continue pressuring the queen side with queen b6 and rook a c8. The knight can come out to e5. And these are positions that I will explore in a lot more depth in subsequent videos. Because there's a lot of ideas to know here. But hopefully this just gives you a very general sense of how these positions are played. Bishop g5 is another possibility here, as I said during the game. But the bishop can be chased away with h6. And if white plays bishop h4, then we can go g5. And how do we win this? Well, we don't win this bishop. We trade it with knight h5. Oh, trading the knight for the dark squared bishop is almost always good for black. This is a slightly worse version because obviously black has made some weaknesses on the king side, but the engine still likes black's position, and so do I. Here we play as we did in the game. And you're never afraid of f4 because queen b6 check just wins the b2 pawn and the game. So white has to be very cautious about opening up his king when in the absence of the dark squared bishop. So bishop e3, knight g4 is automatic. Bishop e6 is automatic. And already I think black is slightly better here. I think white's best move in this position, rook a1, is honestly the beginning of the end. Like after rook fc8, I think white's position is borderline indefensible. Probably white should have gone b3 here. And if we play bishop takes c3, then we should probably refrain from grabbing that pawn because white can run the f pawn up the board. And hopefully you can see how dangerous this could get. You know, queen h6 and then rook h3 becomes a problem. So stay away from this. Much more to the point here would be a move like rook ac8 or, you know, even rook fe8 is a good move. The engine likes this type of move because you take the sting out of the move knight d5. Now this move can be met with bishop takes d5, e takes d5, queen takes a2, whereas earlier the e7 pawn would have been hanging. So then you can play a6 and rook c8 and b5, and black is super, super comfortable here. So again, I won't spend too long on this, but rook a1 is a great example of why I like these positions for black, because people just don't know what to do here. They get the Maróczy bind, they do what is recommended, but then they stare at it and they say, well, how do I improve my position? Whereas black has very clearly defined plans, which we will expand on in subsequent videos, of course. So rook fc8, and again, why did we choose to keep the rook on a8? Because in this line, after rook takes b7, queen takes a2, the pawn is protected and we can just run it up the board. Our opponent decided to exacerbate the situation. Yeah, the engine does actually like rook c2 here. This was even stronger. We could play rook c2 here. No, there was nothing wrong with this move, but I was a little bit worried that our rook would get disattached from the bishop. This apparently does work for black, but I don't like situations where you've got like a queen defending the rook, and then the rook defends the bishop. These are the situations you want to avoid when possible, because there's a very high probability of blundering something. But because we've got full dark square control, white can't chase the rook away from d2. The best that white can do is something like this. That gives the rook an escape hatch, and then we can bring the other rook to c8. So this is just winning for black. a2 is also falling, and this is a disaster. Notice that after rook b1, queen takes a2, queen d2, a cool little tactic that I'll actually end with, and then we'll wrap up. Does anybody see how black can get out of this? Earlier, I mentioned that this loses for black, but the situation has changed. And here there's a very pretty tactical solution. Well, the back rank is weak, right? That everybody should see that. By the way, that's another thing that's never talked about the accelerated dragon. The move g6 creates luft for the king, so you almost never have to deal with back rank weaknesses, and that really can help you. This is a winning endgame because you've got connected passers. And as I'll indicate in the opposite colored bishop video coming out maybe a month from now, these pawns supported by the king, which is going to walk over to the king side, there's no way that white can save this endgame. And you can, good thing to do if you're watching on YouTube is to set this position up and analyze it with an engine for 10 minutes, right? You'll learn a lot about how to play opposite colored bishop endgames, small things that you can do to improve your understanding. It's not that hard, right? As long as you have the patience to do those types of things. Anyways, we decided to play it more straightforwardly. The queen came out, and obviously, again, I really think that I should have taken the queen and played rook to c2. I think this endgame is just dead. White is just dead here because there's no way to stop. The a pawn is supported by a rook from behind and a rook from in front. This is like the ideal setup for the rooks, which doesn't happen often. It happens only when you obviously need to have both of your rooks. So I don't think the result of the game was ever in question. We played it patiently, and I really think that white should have played f4 and probably then played king to g2 to protect the bishop. This maybe was white's last chance to stay in the game, but a move like king g7 here just looks really nasty because we're bringing the rook to h8, and the type 2 prophylaxis concept, something you should take away. White can never move g4 because f4 hangs, so rook h8 is going to create the nasty threat of opening up the h-file and going after the bishop. So there were ways to stay in the game for white, but ultimately it was virtually indefensible. And after we go rook c2, we go after the pawn, we win the pawn, and then we just promote our a pawn. So the technical task was straightforward. And this is where we'll wrap up, folks. I apologize for rushing through the analysis just a little bit, but I'm heading off to Raleigh for the North Carolina State Championship, where I'll be coaching some Charlotte kids. Thank you, Flame and Cornbread. So hopefully people understand. Congrats to Magnus, and I will see you guys later. Thanks for hanging out, everybody. Hope you enjoyed the stream. I'll see everybody on Sunday. Bye.